Well, thank you for the invitation for both of us to be here. I'm simply in the role of an interviewer. The main subject is Dr. Oliver Hartwich. A few things I should discuss with you by way of conflicts of interest. Both of us are members of the New Zealand Initiative. He's the CEO and I'm a member. It's an organisation I support because I think its ideas, critical thinking ideas, are orthodox solutions to some of the issues that we face. Oliver has recently just presided over a off-site annual retreat a couple of days ago, and we had a wonderful day talking with luminaries from around the marketplace and the political sphere around the issues we face and some of the solutions. But you may have picked up in the Herald today an article that's written by Oliver which discusses, amongst other things, the answers to the question, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. I'll just pause there for a moment and let you know that today's discussion is going to combine both data and storytelling. I have looked at AI, ChatGPT, but we're going to use NI, natural intelligence, to sort of work through some of these issues. And the questions, I'm going to do things a little bit differently if we can manage it, which is if you think you want to ask a question during our discussions, then please put your hand up. But the rule is only one question per table. So you'll have to figure out which is the best question on your table. Okay, so let's start with this question that you posed in the Herald today, which was the subject of our retreat, Oliver. There's a lot of ruin in our nation. Why did you say that?
Because I wanted to sound optimistic. And that might surprise you, because it doesn't sound like that. But it's one of those quotes, and it's a quote by Adam Smith that is easy to misread. So there's a lot of ruin in the nation. Okay, you can say, lots of things can go wrong, and actually, if you look at New Zealand, lots of things do go wrong. But what he's actually meant, Adam Smith, by that is actually there are many ways in which you can go wrong and you can still come back, because the context of this discussion was actually a friend saying to Adam Smith, hey, this is all going in the wrong direction and we're doomed. And Adam Smith said, well, hang on. There's a lot of ruin in the nation, but that doesn't mean you can't come back, because there will always be a way out in the end. And that's what I wanted to say. So I wanted to point out two things, both at our conference and in this article in the Herald. We are going wrong, in the wrong direction in so many ways, whether you're looking at education, where our achievement rates are falling, whether you look at our health system, and our hospitals are clearly at breaking point, infrastructure delivery doesn't work, crime, I mean, we could continue. There's hardly any area of public policy in New Zealand that still works. There is a lot of ruin in our nation, but we can come back. And that's really the point of the initiative, that's the point of our work, because we research all of these areas and we make recommendations. We don't just state the fact and tell you how terrible things are. We always have recommendations, and we argue that by learning from other countries that are a bit more successful on some of these policy matters, we can do better, we can come back. And so actually, this quote, I think, is a quote of optimism.
Thank you. So Chatham House rule prevails today, which is that you can discuss what we talk about, but you can't ascribe what we talk about to any particular person. So just bear that in mind. Let's just turn then to something that was discussed at the Berkshire Hathaway, and we haven't swapped notes, so I have no idea how he's going to respond. He doesn't know what question I'm going to ask him. So we're at the Berkshire Hathaway ASM a few weeks ago, and Charlie Munger, 90 plus, comes out with a quote, "The golden age for investing is over. Investors will need to be content with a period of lower returns." So I want to turn now to a specific part of the question put to us today, which is not just the economy, but the quote, is this the end of cheap money? And talk a little bit more about monetary policy and the equilibrium where interest rates need to be, given the economic issues that we'll talk about further. So in the discussion document, monetary policy statement, we came out with a 5-2 vote in favour of a rise in rates, 5.25 to 5.5, and flatlining for 12 to 18 months. So the question is, why did 2 vote for a pause? That's one question. What was that going on about? And how did the Treasury get to publish an estimate of the impact of the fiscal stimulation of $4.8 billion extra spending, which would be normally result in a 0.3% rise in the OCR, and yet we only get 25 basis points. So we're sort of thinking, I'm thinking in my mind, are we building to a policy mistake? How can we have in the half-year accounts, the HUFU, in 14 December last year, minus 0.3% GDP in 2024, now it's 1%. Recession's gone. And yet the central bank doesn't seem to be taking that into account. So I'm asking, Oliver, is there a policy mistake in here somewhere?
Oh, the policy mistake has already happened. I think we have completely overstimulated the economy over the last few years. I mean, our Reserve Bank at the beginning of COVID started talking about flooding the market with $100 billion of QE. They stopped halfway, of course, because by that time it was already clear they were overcooking everything. But still, the damage has been done. And on the other side of the coin, of course, on fiscal policy, the same happened. So if you look at government spending today, per capita in New Zealand, we are spending about $4,800 more inflation adjusted and per capita compared to what the government spent in 2017 when this current government took over. So we stimulated the economy on both sides, on the fiscal side, on the monetary side, and now it's a task of cleaning up. And I think we are probably making more mistakes in that cleanup task. So one of the websites that we both like, I know, is GDP Live. And if you're on your phones, go to gdplive.net right now and have a look, because it's a website run out of Massey University by my friend, Professor Christoph Schumacher. And Christoph has done something that no other country in the world has. It's a live tracker for GDP. Typically, Stats New Zealand tells you 3-4 months later how the economy used to do. Christoph has trained an AI, 25,000 lines of code, 10 years worth of data, and every night he gets new data from TradeMe, from the ports, from KiwiRail, from other sources. And he's trained the AI to take the data and actually crunch it down and say, what was GDP yesterday? What was inflation yesterday? How are we tracking? The kind of data that any bank analyst and probably any central banker would dream of, because typically you only find out after the fact. And if you look at GDP Live, you can see that, yes, inflation has come down a little bit. Currently about, I think, 6.7% last time I checked. But he also calculates the Taylor rule. So the Taylor rule is a rule in economics and monetary economics that would tell you how much you would have to set the OCR to bring us back down to the target level of between 1% and 3% inflation, with a midpoint of 2. Well, and if you look at that, I actually haven't looked at it this morning, but last time I checked it was above 8. And if you consider now that actually the Reserve Bank didn't get us up to 8, we're still below that level, what it tells me is that we can expect that inflation might actually fall a little bit further, because we used to be at 7.3, now we're at 6.7, so it's kind of coming down. But it probably will not go down to the target range, because for that to happen, we would have to increase the OCR by probably another 2 percentage points. And therefore, I think we can discuss, is this a policy mistake? So if you think that we need to get inflation urgently back under control where it should be, then clearly it is. But that also means that you would have to really drive the economy into a deep recession and cause more pain for households, because it is already pretty tough out there. So really you have to weigh the different consequences of the actions. But as I said, we are just making mistakes now in the cleanup process, because the real big mistake happened 3 years ago. So
let's just spin this out a bit. So can someone just tell me what the latest OCR expectation from GDP Live is? Is it 8.9? If someone can just raise their hand to confirm that. 8.9. So 5.5 today to 8.9. And you're kind of like, how's that possible? But this is a website that gathers live data on movements in FPOS and port containers, transport links, thousands and thousands and thousands of bits of information that our Reserve Bank and Treasury just don't have. And they're looking backwards. This is current data, and it's 100% 24/7. It's all AI. It's marvelous. So have a think about that when you're thinking about scenarios, and just check against that. What would happen if? What would happen if? So why do you think, Oliver, the central bank is thinking at 5.5 when inflation under the Treasury's forecast is still at 3.3 in the next financial year, and the unemployment rate is well below NAIRU, that non-accelerating rate of unemployment, about 4.25, 4.5. How does that indicate something else to you around the time frame for the inflation nirvana of 1 to 3?
I have almost given up on the Reserve Bank trying to understand the decision making, because I don't think it's rational and reasonable at all. It hasn't been for the last few years. For the first few years of Governor Orr's tenure, I think the Reserve Bank completely lost the plot on monetary policy altogether. They were dealing with all sorts of things. They started talking about the Maori economy. They likened themselves to Tane Mahuta. They even installed a depiction of Tane Mahuta in the entrance of the Reserve Bank at a cost of $500,000. Then they talked about climate change. A couple of years ago, we actually went through their annual report and just looked at how many times climate change was mentioned and compared that to mentions of inflation. And I think it was a ratio of 1 for 10. So climate change just dominated the Reserve Bank's reporting, and inflation was a footnote, basically. So you can really go through all the publications of the Reserve Bank, and you see that they were distracted by all their other new targets. And on top of that, of course, the government gave the Reserve Bank now a responsibility for the labor market as well. Then the Reserve Bank was reminded by the government that they should also look into house prices, and their core mandate of price stability fell by the wayside. And so I think the Reserve Bank got distracted. And I haven't been able to really make sense of decision-making anymore. I mean, if you look at yesterday's decision, if you take into account where the Reserve Bank used to stand, for example, on migration, the Reserve Bank used to argue that when you increase migration massively, you have, at least in the short run, more demand-side pressures rather than supply-side easing. And therefore, with now expected intake of 100,000 migrants net, you would have expected the Reserve Bank to respond to that and actually tighten a bit more. You would have also expected them to take into account the budget, which was, once again, very generous in spending. And of course, the Reserve Bank would have to fight a little bit back against fiscal policy, well, they didn't. And actually, in their analysis yesterday, they told us, no, it's fine, and it's all coming down, except it's not coming down as fast as the government previously projected. So if you take all of that together, that would have given you the justification for at least 50 basis points, and not 25. And instead, we have 2 members of the Monetary Policy Committee now saying, actually, they should have kept it as it was. But then again, I've also given up on the Monetary Policy Committee a bit. I mean, many of you probably won't realize it, but if you're qualified as a macroeconomist or a monetary economist, you are forbidden from serving on the Monetary Policy Committee by law. As if you're the best monetary policy expert in the world, in New Zealand, you wouldn't be allowed to sit on a Monetary Policy Committee because allegedly you've got a conflict of interest. I would have thought most other central banks would try to take the most qualified people for their monetary policy committees, but New Zealand does it better. So we just block you out. The best thing is you have no idea of monetary policy, and then we put you on the committee. So, and I'm not making this up, by the way. This is how the Reserve Bank of New Zealand runs. And so, on your question, trying to make sense of them, it is really hard. The best way I can make sense of them is actually to realize that this is a political institution these days. There's an election this year, and of course the last thing that a political governor like Adrian Orr wants to do is to now annoy the government that has just reappointed him and tell them, actually, your fiscal policy is counterproductive and I need to kind of put on the brakes. He probably doesn't want to get fired after the election. He will get fired if we have a change of government. But in the other case, which now looks increasingly likely, he will probably keep his job.
So there's no time frame under the agreement between the finance minister and the governor around the time it takes to get to 1 to 3?
Yeah, and I don't think the Minister of Finance's priority is there.
No.
And actually, you have a lot of statements coming out of officialdom and some newspaper commentators. Is 1 to 3% really the right target range, or should we go to 2 to 4? So you can already see that the narrative is moving, and we are now putting up with slightly higher inflation rates. Problem is, of course, if you're doing this longer, it becomes increasingly hard to bring it back down because you're building up expectations. If the market gets used to that, 4% is the new normal, well, then the market will behave accordingly. And there is no political signal actually working against that.
But we've got a new board of governors of the Reserve Bank now.
Yeah, wonderful, isn't it? They're equally qualified.
So I can feel the kind of angst with the settings of governance inside our central bank, but let's try and broaden this to a bit more of a global perspective. And let's take the example of a Greek olive farmer who needs a new tractor. Tell us about what happens in the European Union around how they apply for credit. To try and help the audience understand that this is not just a New Zealand issue, but a central banking issue worldwide.
Well, we have talked about the Greek tractor, the two of us, before, so I know what you're aiming at. It's Target 2. Maybe a test for the audience. Has anyone here heard of Target 2? Ah, okay, great. This is the biggest black hole in international finance, I think, and if you haven't heard of it, look it up. Just Google Bundesbank and Target 2, and you will find that the biggest position on the Bundesbank's balance sheet, worth about 1.1 trillion euros, is this Target 2. Now you will, oh, what is Target 2?
Just one before you explain.
Yes.
In about 60 seconds, the New Zealand government will be trying a new weapon to take to Ukraine. It goes off every day at 12 o'clock. So don't be frightened if you hear a loud bang. So on that warning, please continue.
We've hosted conferences here before. I know what happens. So, right. So Target 2 is a clearance mechanism. And as everybody knows, a clearance mechanism isn't supposed to carry any balances. I mean, it's just there to shift money around, right? And every central bank has something like that. So the Federal Reserve has a clearing mechanism as well. But there are no balances. And that's exactly how it... Are they counting down to that? I don't know.
Maybe.
So, when the Eurozone started, the Eurozone also got its clearing mechanism, that is Target 2, and it's meant to actually shift money around from one country to the other. Bank transfers, basically, and it didn't carry any balances. Whoop. But then something happened. What happened was actually 2007, so right before the GFC. Markets were getting a little bit jittery about what's happening in Greece, and they didn't want to lend money to Greece anymore. They didn't want to shift capital to Greek banks because they looked a little bit wobbly. Now, Greece has a trade deficit which they need to finance, but if there is no one there in international markets to finance Greece, they've got a bit of a problem. And here we come to the tractor and the farmer. So imagine you are a Greek farmer. You would like to buy a new German tractor. You go to your bank and ask for a loan. And the bank says, well, actually, we would like to, but we can't refinance ourselves. Well, no, actually, the bank didn't say that. The bank actually went to the Greek central bank and said, we've got a problem. We can't refinance. Can we please get some euros? So the Greek central bank actually at that stage created some euros out of thin air, credited the account of the commercial bank of that Greek farmer. The farmer got his loan, paid for the tractor. So the money goes through the Target 2 system, from the Greek commercial bank to the Greek central bank to the European central bank to the German Bundesbank to the bank of the tractor manufacturer. So the tractor manufacturer gets paid. The problem is, in all of this, there is new money created in Greece, which wasn't supposed to be created, money out of thin air. And for that money created, the rest of the Eurozone got a credit, a claim against Greece. And this is what happened in the beginning of the Euro crisis, and it continued then as capital flight set in, when they tried to get the money out of Greece, get the money out of Portugal, get the money out of Spain, get the money out of Italy. And their central banks had to recreate some money just to keep the system alive. And they kept this going. And I've always argued, actually, that the Euro crisis isn't over. And you can see it's not over when you look at the Target 2 balances. So if you have by now Googled the Bundesbank's page, you would have found that it's now 1.1 trillion euros that Germany has a claim for against the Eurozone. It's a bit more than 2/3 of their central bank's balance sheet, and it is about 5-6 times Germany's gold reserves. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because no country is ever now allowed to leave the Eurozone, because at that stage they would have to kind of come clean. And then they would have to pay what they have created and which they shouldn't have created. And conversely, of course, if Germany at any stage decided, well, we've had enough with the system, well, they could basically write off their 1.1 trillion euros and would have to recapitalize their central bank. I mean, Germany is a relatively large country, but 1.1 trillion euros is still money. And that could be quite ugly. So I think it is that fear of what to do with this kind of clearance mechanism that has become a tool of credit that is keeping the Eurozone alive. And what always surprises me is that how few people, even in finance, have heard of Target 2 when it is such a massive black hole.
So the fiscal pressures that ultimately end up in central bank balance sheets are present in the Federal Reserve, the New Zealand Central Bank and the ECB. Why aren't bond markets more worried about that? Why is there this degree of complacency?
Probably because it's always been like this. Well, not always. Since 1971. That was when Richard Nixon, of course, took us off the last bits of the gold standard, got the US out of the Bretton Woods system, and ever since we've been in this wonderful world of fiat money, where money can just be created, where interest rates can be set at random, where it's political institutions in charge of the most important price in the economy, which is the price of credit. And we've become used to that as a political tool. So in the end, we will always bail markets out, we will bail banks out, we will bail whole countries out if things go wrong. And therefore, things might look unsustainable, and I think they are, and they look terrible, and they're really frightening, but in the end, we still think, well, it's been running like this for more than 50 years. There will always be a central bank somewhere coming to our rescue and bail us out. And the thing is, you can do that, and we have done that many, many times. I mean, we had crises in the 80s, we had a Russian crisis, an Asian crisis, we had the crisis with the dot-com bubble when it burst, we had the GFC, we had COVID, there was always someone coming to our rescue. At some stage, of course, this game is up. The problem with economists is we can tell you when things are unsustainable, we just don't know how long it takes until we realize that.
Yes. So owning New Zealand sovereign risk, still nominal terms, still well below the rate of inflation. The credit rating agency S&P, I think, came out after the budget saying they're watching, particularly the fiscal pressures, etc. So again, we're under scrutiny, and being on the edge, I guess if the centre implodes, we risk being on the periphery, being hurt a lot more. So when you look at the bond funding task, I think it's $4 billion extra next year, but that keeps going up to a total of around $192 billion of sovereign debt in the next 3 to 4 years. That's a lot of issuance that has to happen into the world. Can you see global investors taking a little bit more caution around the spreads of how they value New Zealand debt against other nations?
Well,
and that really goes to a current account question.
Yeah. Well, let's put it this way. Many people, many analysts think of credit rating agencies' reports as a kind of a weather forecast, telling you how it's going to be tomorrow. I actually think it's more like a thermometer. And actually, it's more like a thermometer reading from yesterday. So Greece, for example, in 2007 had a AA rating. It looked fine. The ratings agencies basically all said this is investment grade, it's all fine, it's under control. And they only changed their minds when it was absolutely blatantly obvious that it wasn't. And then suddenly it was junk. But it really took just about half a year until they got to that conclusion. So ratings agencies, they can change their minds very quickly, and usually they come too late. And when you look at New Zealand, I'm surprised actually we're still rated as highly as we are. Because, yeah, okay, our government debt is relatively low compared to other OECD countries, but then again, we have no safety net here because nobody needs to be invested in New Zealand. There are some countries where you have no choice, you have to be in them. New Zealand is not one of them. We have absolutely no safety net, we have no luxury of someone bailing us out. We have to be responsible. On top of that, we have a very high level of private debt, which is higher than in many OECD countries. So once you combine the two, actually, you see the true nature of the country. Combine that with a current account deficit, which is now the highest in the developed world. We're actually beating Greece on that measure. It doesn't look particularly sustainable to me. And of course, we know we have a long-standing problem with productivity. We now have problems in practically every area of government policy. Things are not going in the right direction. The only thing that makes us look a little bit better at the moment is migration. Very tight labor market too, from the time when we didn't have migration. But none of this actually looks appealing. I wouldn't want to be here as an investor at the moment. I think there are better options.
So the last time I recall that we had to go cap in hand to global markets to bail ourselves out was the Nash finance minister in the 1938-39 government, where we went cap in hand to London capital markets to request a rollover of, I think it was a £9 million loan, like in today's term, doesn't sound very much, but enormous amounts then, and the private bankers were refusing to do so. And we had 2 or 3 months of negotiating unsuccessfully, but we were bailed out by World War II, and London basically said, we'll take all your meat and wool for the next 12 months. And so we got out of it. Is that likely to happen now? I don't think so. Well, who's going to bail us out?
Well, first of all, that story, if you're interested in it, you can read it up in a book called Illusions of History, written by my colleague Bryce Wilkinson. We published that last year, and it's freely available on our website. So he actually talks about that episode. No, we're not going to see a repeat of that. And actually, we're not going to see a repeat of 1984 either, because we have a free-floating currency. So we'll probably see this in the exchange rate of the Kiwi dollar, but that is only when markets internationally wake up. Unfortunately, I think markets don't, and markets don't pay enough attention to us here. We actually, I think, traded for a long time on international goodwill towards our former Prime Minister, who had this superstar status, and everybody thought New Zealand is doing brilliantly because she is such a superstar. Well, markets have never really properly looked here, and actually many analysts analyzing New Zealand's circumstances are based in Sydney or Singapore or Hong Kong. They can see us from afar, but I think the experience on the ground is probably a bit different. And by the way, that's the same for newspapers, for media. There are hardly any international correspondents left. The reports you typically read about New Zealand in The Economist or the New York Times are written by people who are thousands of kilometers away. So I think our image internationally is still a lot better than the reality on the ground.
So if our central banking systems, I'm using this word advisedly, but let's say ossified because the voters, the taxpayers involved can't see a way of unwinding the construct that we're in, what's left for economic reform? Is it really just micro reform? What else can we do to improve our prospects?
Well, that's exactly what we need to do, because if you think about it, we have tried to solve every crisis, every economic crisis, every recession in the last 50 years, not just in New Zealand, with macro tools. We had this Keynesian belief that you just have to print some more money or spend some more money and everything will be fine. So the macro side has taken care of things. The micro side is actually what we need to do now. We have to reform New Zealand on the micro settings to make it a country in which markets can actually work properly. And unfortunately, we are masters at self-sabotage in this country. We really managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory each time we have to make a policy decision. So, I mean, a country with 52,500 square meters of land per man, woman, and child, and even if you include all our sheep, you still have 10,000 square meters of land. And we have a housing shortage. I mean, this is quite a policy achievement. In a country the size of New Zealand, geographical size of Italy, but really just with 5 million people that uses 1% of its land for development to create a housing shortage. That's quite an achievement. It's stunning. Another one is actually FDI. We are not attracting FDI as we should. We currently get about 2 to 3 billion US dollars of FDI per year, which puts us in a league with Latvia and Uzbekistan and Guatemala, so the real economic powerhouses of this world. And why? Because we have an Overseas Investment Act, which is really hard to play. We have an Overseas Investment Office that is chronically understaffed. And when international investors look at that, they rather take their money to Switzerland or somewhere else. And so we're completely missing out on value chains. We have actually basically kept our stock of FDI stagnant for the last 30 years, while other countries have actually powered on. We're going to Ireland, and you mentioned that before, with a delegation of business leaders in June. And one of the reasons is we want to figure out how the Irish have done that, because in Ireland, the stock of FDI per person, US dollars, is 250,000. In 1990, Ireland and New Zealand had the same GDP per capita. Now the Irish are twice as rich. Go figure. But again, self-sabotage. I mean, no country needs an Overseas Investment Act like ours. We are only hurting ourselves, and we're masters of that. We are ruining the country with our stupid laws on every front, and we need to change that. We need microeconomic reform, because otherwise this country is going downhill. We'll become a Pacific island.
Well, we are a Pacific island.
Yeah, but in a metaphorical sense too.
Right, okay.
Fiji, but without the weather.
Okay, well, now that we're having a wet season and a dry season, we're not having 4 seasons anymore, maybe it is the same weather. Okay, end of cheap money, 0.25% OCR in October 21, 5.5% yesterday. So I guess in some senses, the cheap era is finished, and I think we're saying we've got lots of issues ahead, which is going to mean it's unlikely to see that OCR coming back down pretty quick, either on the RBNZ forecast or GDP Live or some of the views that Oliver's putting forward. I want to pause now. We've got 15 minutes. Conscious there may be questions in the audience, but the rule is only 1 question per table, and we're not going to run Slido because I think we need some interaction with people. So can we have a hand up? If you're really keen to make a question, 2 hands, and I'll be really keen. 2 hands down the back. Sir, table. Okay.
Working?
I can repeat it if you need to. So,
I was just wondering, what are the top 3 areas of micro reform that you think would really benefit New Zealand?
So top 3 micro reforms.
Oh, I think I've already mentioned them. Housing. So it's no secret why housing is as unaffordable as it is. It is because we have not released enough land for development, so we need to reform the RMA, and I don't mean the reform currently before Parliament, because that's only going to make things worse. We need to have better incentives for local government to build, because currently we ask them to provide the infrastructure to deal with the neighbors who don't like development, but then when it comes to the tax generation out of it, the GST, the income taxes, the corporate taxes go to Wellington, and I'm surprised, it doesn't work. So we have to reform housing. Next one, FDI, basically get rid of this act. I mean, Britain doesn't even have an Overseas Investment Act, and they live too. Most countries are actually grateful when it happens. And by the way, once international investors are here, they have to comply with all the national domestic legislation anyway. So why do we put hurdles in their way? And once you have done that, by the way, you've solved quite a few markets along the way. You probably would have solved the retail market as well, because one of the reasons why we haven't got the likes of Aldi in this country to provide a bit more competition in retail is because for each individual supermarket that they might want to open, they will probably have to apply for approval from the Overseas Investment Office and then deal with the RMA. So, and my third one, and that's probably the most important one in the long run, is education. Because we have an education system in which currently more than 40% of school leavers are functionally illiterate or innumerate. And we've known this since 2014 when the Tertiary Education Commission did something radical and tested students. And we've actually known this even more since last year, because now the Education Ministry is running a pilot study. They have finally realized that you need to test school leavers before you give them a certificate. Really revolutionary. So for literacy, that is reading and writing, well, reading is a bit better. It's closer to 60% that pass. Numeracy, so basic calculations, we're not talking about university stuff. It's just basic stuff. It's just about half. But writing, only a third of our students after 12 years of school meet the basic standard for writing ability that we would expect of school leavers. Again, not writing university reports, just a letter to your utility provider, something like that. So the ministry actually said we need to actually pass all 3 tests, otherwise you wouldn't get an NCA certificate in the future. According to that, we would have to fail at least 2/3 of each year. At least 2/3. When the ministry found out that the pilot study was disastrous, they first wrote to NZQA and said, we have to delay this. And then they asked, can we actually make the test a bit simpler? Seriously, we will not be able to compete with the likes of China, Singapore, India in the future if we don't teach our students. So 3 reforms that we have to do immediately: housing with infrastructure financing, FDI just opening the country to international investors, and completely reforming our education system because it is failing us and it's failing our kids.
Good answers. Next question. Yes, second question from the same table. Okay, follow up.
Just wondering, sort of looking globally, are there any central banks that have actually done a good job over the past 10 years? It could be a short answer like no, but...
Well, yes, if you just judge them by their outcomes, but the circumstances are a bit different. I mean, not every country is currently experiencing the kind of inflation we are experiencing. So Switzerland is a different story, Japan is a different story. I would like to point out Norway. I find Norway quite interesting. So you compare the RBNZ's response to COVID in early 2020 to the Norwegian central bank, and you see almost an exact same spike in money supply. So they both panicked, and I think everybody panicked at the time because we hadn't been there before, and provided a lot more monetary stimulus. The difference between Norway and us was that the Norwegian bank actually realized quite quickly, hey, we're dealing not with a demand crisis, we're dealing with a supply shock, an exogenous supply shock, kind of textbook style. And they quickly reduced their money supply, whereas the RBNZ kept printing and printing and printing. So I think actually the Norwegian bank probably holds a few lessons for us. They didn't have to shrink their balance sheet as much as we do now because they never really went for the excesses of stimulus. So yes, there were some central banks doing a comparatively better job than us. By the way, even the ECB, which is not my favorite central bank, did a relatively modest job compared to the RBNZ on QE stimulus.
Question for you, Oliver, around our debt, our public debt. What do you think the ratio should be, given that we have this exposure to natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic weather events? are we a nation that needs to have a different view of the level of debt because it's an important buffer for disasters?
Yep, totally agree. Previously, we thought it should be 20% of GDP. Now, Minister Robertson has actually changed the way we measure that and increased it to 30% regardless, so it's more like 40%, so it's doubling that. I think it's too high. I mean, 40% doesn't sound much when you compare to France or Germany or Britain, but actually for us here with our exposure to risk and our vulnerable state as a nation, I think that's too high. So we should really go back to how we first measured government debt, and then we should really bring it down to a maximum of 20%. And actually, frankly, do we need to have government debt here at all much? And don't come with infrastructure investment. I think we could do this privately.
Okay, so given the, yes, Sharuk. Nico, I'll repeat it if you like, so.
Oh,
It's coming? Okay, thank you.
So given your, particularly rosy outlook for New Zealand, just wondering from the investment advice asset allocation point of view, would you agree that it may be prudent to reduce allocation to New Zealand equities, for example, or perhaps just, look for other options?
I think if I were an international investor, I would probably think about that. Because I'm really just waiting for this report now by one of the ratings agencies telling us that actually things in New Zealand are not as rosy as we thought they were. I'm waiting for that Australian bank to tell us, and I'm actually hoping for that in some way, because unless the outside world tells us, we will not come to that conclusion ourselves, because we are still living in this kind of bubble where we think things will be fine, we'll get out of this, the rest of the world loves us. I think it actually takes that root shock to our system until we start reforming. Because you look at last week's budget, and that was a kind of business as usual big government spend budget, and nobody here took notice, and we thought, yeah, that's just the way things are here, and we're kind of okay with that. No, we're not okay, because we're really going downhill. This country is not managed well at the moment, and somebody needs to tell us if we don't find it out ourselves.
I think the coverage ratio in the most recent Treasury auctions have been slightly problematic, which might tell you that global investors are being a little bit more concerned. So given that outlook... Yes.
I'll just jump in. I've got my mic here anyway. Can you talk a bit about this shift in policy? Your predecessor organisation probably scored 2 fantastic home runs with the broadband initiative, which was largely driven by the New Zealand Institute, as it was then, and also KiwiSaver, obviously.
Yep.
The initiative seems to produce a lot of great policy stuff, but it just doesn't move the dial. Why is this? Why do we just have this inertia that as a country we can't move policy on?
First of all, I think we are moving policy in a few ways which you might not have noticed. So at least we convinced National now of our education policy. I can tell you when Erica Stanford became National's education spokesperson, she asked one of her colleagues, so what do we believe in? And she was handed over a pack of the initiative's education reports, and they basically took them all on board. And a couple of months ago, Chris Luxon announced the policy doing the basics brilliantly, and that's basically us. So should we have a change of government, we will have a change in education policy. The other thing that will probably happen after a change of government is we will finally get incentives for councils. So this kind of localism and incentivization that I've been talking about here for 11 years now, and people thought I was crazy when I started talking about this, including our board. It's happening. There's a bill in front of Parliament, a private member's bill, Brooke van Velden, on sharing GST with councils. And that is something that comes directly out of our advocacy of the last decade. So there are some parties listening, and there is a chance, of course, that we will get some of this implemented. The problem seems to be actually that at least half the country still seems to be kind of content with the way things go, because we haven't got the opposition hugely in front at the moment, of course. So why does it happen? I've got no great explanation other than MMP. I mean, coming from Germany, I can only apologize. I mean, why of all things did you copy that?
Yes.
MMP is a recipe for not much happening, which maybe you should have introduced by the time you had completely reformed the economy, because it would have preserved it. but unfortunately you weren't ready for it. So we introduced it at a time when there were still a lot of reform needs, and every year that passes just makes it worse. So MMP, I think, is a problem. The short time horizon, the 3-year cycle, too short. I mean, by the time that you actually know how to govern, you have to fight an election campaign again. It doesn't make sense. And on top of that, I think it's actually a question of the media. So I found the coverage of last week's budget really appallingly poor in the media. We could have pointed out all the problems with this budget, and instead we're talking about trifles again. We're talking about the $5 prescription subsidy, and it's a wonderfully crafted political trap designed by Robertson and Hipkins, and of course Luxon would fall straight into it. But we're spending our time too much with these trifles. We should actually be talking about what actually moves the dial. How do we shift this country forward? How can we once again be a rockstar economy that we thought we were in 2015?
Thank you. Does that indicate that you're concerned that 50% of those in the polls don't recognise what's beneath the waterline in the iceberg? Do they not understand that? Why, given those issues that you've outlined, is the polls not trending more centre-right?
Well, it's a bit weird. When you ask New Zealanders, are you happy with the direction of the country, we now have almost 60% saying, no, we aren't. This country is going in the wrong direction. And I mean, if you've ever needed medical care, if you needed to see a GP, if you had a trip to A&E, if you have kids at school, or if you're concerned about potholes, yeah, you've got enough reasons to be concerned, and traffic cones in Auckland. So people realize something's not quite right. And yet the opposition hasn't probably made the case enough for a real change of direction. And so people are sticking with the people they know. And they're probably going for the one politician they would rather like to have a beer with. And Christopher Luxon doesn't drink.
Well, there's something I didn't know. Okay, cool. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
In your experience thus far, in your experience thus far, if we proceed down the path we are, how many years does it take to turn it around? If we have 3 years of bad governance, if it turns into 6, God forbid, is it 3 times every year of bad governance on average? So if we have 6 years of it, it could take us 18 or 12. What's your experience so far, looking globally?
Well, it depends on what kind of policies you implement and how radical you are. There is a lot of ruin in the nation. We can go wrong in loads of ways, but we can always come back, provided we have the courage and the right policy prescriptions. My favorite example, and I know we're out of time, but if I have a minute, my favorite example comes from the country where I was born, and that's Germany, of course. Germany, a country in ruins in 1945, totally bombed out, morally disgraced. This was not a country where you would expect an economic recovery. But in West Germany, we got an economic miracle. And by the late 1960s, actually, Germany overtook Britain in GDP per capita for the first time. Why? Because in 1945, they were lucky. They put a liberal economist called Ludwig Erhard in charge. And he was gutsy. He was totally gutsy. He was in charge in the American-occupied zone because he was someone who was not in bed with the Nazis. He was clean. He was a liberal market economist. But he was put in charge of, for example, price controls, and then he abolished them overnight on a Sunday, because he knew the Americans weren't working. And so he was summoned to the American general, Lucius de Clay, and he said, Mr. Erhard, did you not know that you were not supposed to change the price controls? He says, I didn't change them, I abolished them. But Mr. Erhard, all my advisors are telling me, you're making a massive mistake here. Oh, he says, Mr. General, don't worry, my advisors are telling me the same. And he did it anyway. So he freed the economy, he introduced an independent central bank with a focus on price stability, freedom of contract, so a complete classical liberal prescription. And after just a few years, Germany had economic growth rates that they had never seen before. It was the economic miracle, and this country came back out of the ruins, I mean literal ruins of the war, and became the economic powerhouse of Europe within a decade. And as I said, by the late 1960s, Britain was in crisis and nothing worked anymore, and it ended up, of course, in the winter of discontent when Margaret Thatcher took over in 1979. But Germany just powered ahead because they had this one liberalization, driven by this one man, Ludwig Erhard, against all the odds, against the Americans who didn't like it, against his own party who didn't like it. But he did it because he believed in it and he knew these were the policies that the country needed. And he turned that country around. If we had that one politician here, or maybe a group of politicians, we can turn New Zealand around. It's totally up to us. We don't have to be content with the state of this country. We don't have to continue self-sabotaging this country. We can actually get cracking and turn things around, but we have to want it to. And that is something I'm missing, and that's why I'm looking at all of you here, the business community. You have to help with that, because the public doesn't quite understand it yet. We are writing columns like the one in the Herald today. We're writing for the Australian, for Stuff. We have a newsletter. I don't know how much media we can do, but we need help, because this country needs a turnaround, because this country is now that case, a case of a country that is on the precipice of decline. And it is up to all of you to turn this around with us.
On that really optimistic note, I think we've concluded that the era of cheap money is over. I hope you've enjoyed both the data and the storytelling. I want you all to thank Dr. Oliver Hartwich very much for his engaging conversation with you before lunch. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.